So, how well do you know your enemies? Probably not as well as you think, but don't worry. I'm here to help by providing the origins, history, and even trivia of some of gaming's most memorable enemies. And this time I'm featuring an enemy that fans have been begging to see come back for quite some time now. While they've made appearances in recent games, they've yet to return to the same role they are so well known for. I'm of course talking about the Kritters, a member of King K. Rool's crew. They are by far the most recurring type of Kremling in the Donkey Kong Country games. But how did Rare actually come up with their design? Well, they, and the Kremlings in general, were originally meant to be enemies in a completely different game. What game, you ask? Well, according to Kevin Bayliss, who is an artist at Rareware, they were meant for a new entry in Battletoads. Rare apparently liked the design so much, they decided to see how they fit in the new Donkey Kong game they were developing. After plugging them in, their style seemed to match perfectly, and they stuck. And it seems to make a lot of sense when you compare the design of the Kritters to the Battletoads. Both have green skin, a golden chest, and a muscular physique. Plus, crocodiles are predators of toads, so they would have fit as enemies in that game. So let's look exactly at how Kritters are designed in the original Donkey Kong Country. They are pretty much walking crocodiles, which keeps them simple and recognizable. There's nothing overtly dangerous about them either, as Donkey Kong can either roll into them or jump on them with little trouble. However, they do come in several different colors. Green is their most common color, and they mainly walked forward in small groups, which makes them comparable to the Goombas in Super Mario Bros. But, unlike the Goombas, Kritters had a few different variations in their original game. Brown and blue Kritters could also be found as players progressed, and they had a new move, jumping. The blue Kritters could slowly jump forward, while the brown Kritters were limited to jumping back and forth or up and down in place. Despite the new move, they could still be taken out in the same ways as before. Oddly, these weren't the only colors given to the Kritters. In the Game Boy Advance remake of Donkey Kong Country, many of the Kritters that were green in the original were colored purple in this version. Likewise, new colors were added for the Kritters, though they were never given any new tactics. They still acted the same as always. This could be because they needed to stand out more on the GBA's smaller screen, so the new purple Kritters wouldn't get lost in the green background of a forest, and the other new colors would stand out against the other backgrounds as well. The only time Kritters of all kinds, including the ones that jumped, appeared as the same color was in Donkey Kong Land for the original Game Boy. But that was more because of the system's black and white limitation than artistic choice. There was one Kremling that could be considered a kind of critter in Donkey Kong Country though, Crashes. They looked like every other critter except they would ride in the minecarts. But this change of name to fit their role is something we see a lot of when it comes to critters in the SNES games. And if you're still not convinced that Crashes are critters, just look at the Game Boy Advance remake. Like the Kritters, the Crashes were all recolored purple. Crashes themselves were invincible as long as they were in motion. They would ride in their carts toward Donkey and Diddy Kong in an attempt to take them out. But if the Crashes were not moving, the Kongs could jump on them to kick them out of the cart and commandeer it, showing that they had the same weaknesses as the Kritters. But despite being such a staple of the original game, the Kritters are curiously absent from the sequel, Donkey Kong Country 2. Well, at least technically. In their stead was a new kind of Kremling called Clomps, but these guys are pretty much just critters in pirate gear with a peg leg. The only major difference is that their chest isn't yellow but a lighter green. And there is one other interesting thing to note about their design. They're covered in scars, which seems like an excessive amount of detail for something that can't be easily seen in the game. It's never explicitly said, but perhaps all of the Clomps are just critters that return after being defeated in the first game, only now sporting battle wounds. Or it could be as simple as them rebranding themselves in the same way as K. Rool, who went from a king to a captain. Otherwise, the Clomps act just the same as Kritters. They walk in small groups and can be easily taken out with any attack. The major difference between Kritters and Clomps is that every Clomp in Donkey Kong Country 2 is the same green color. They don't have a variety of colors like the Kritters in the original game. However, unlike the Kritters in Donkey Kong Country, there are no jumping Clomps this time around. Instead, that role was given to another new type of Kremling, who also took inspiration from the Kritters called Kaboings. These guys have two peg legs which forces them to jump everywhere. Sometimes they jumped in place while other times they moved horizontally, but unlike the Kritters that could jump, they're all colored either gray or green. The gray Kaboings are the more common of the two, with the green ones being able to move and jump slightly faster. Continuing the tradition of replacing enemy types, Donkey Kong Country 3 also lacked the Kritters, as well as Clomps. Instead, the game featured the Cobbles who, surprise surprise, take on the role of the Kritters, although they do look slightly different, sporting a slightly bulkier muscle tone, a longer tail that curls up its back, and a lip ring. Otherwise, they act exactly the same as both the Kritters and Clomps, with the same tactics and weaknesses. In fact, the only thing really notable about them is how much less common they are, only appearing in the boardwalk levels. Although, Cobbles do get a little more love in the GBA remake of Donkey Kong Country 3. That version had them piloting boats while getting in the player's way, and various extra minigame challenges. And these guys have another similarity to the Kritters, and Clomps, too. And that's the fact there's another enemy type that looks just like them, Skittas. Look, they even have the same lip ring. The only real difference is that this variation is purple and can only be found in cold climates where they wobble back and forth on slippery surfaces. Based on all of this, I don't really know why Rare felt the need to give Skittas their own identity. Maybe they just really wanted to use that Skittas row pun. There is some variation to the Critter relatives in Donkey Kong Country 3 though. While Cobbles and Skittas can't jump, a new type of Kremling was introduced to do just that. Recoils, who take the place of the Kaboings in this game. They have a springy tail and their tongues are always hanging out. Recoil's body type does seem to be in line with the Critter family, although there's never been an official connection between the two. And curiously, they actually appear in the game more frequently than Cobbles. And by the way, does their yellow and orange body and springy tail remind you of anyone else? Oh, I don't know, maybe Tigger from Winnie the Pooh? Is that just a coincidence, or did Rare take direct inspiration? Though Donkey Kong 64 was the next platforming game to feature the Critter family, they actually had a small role in the spin-off title Diddy Kong Racing a couple of years earlier. And by small, I mean they were one of the playable characters who helped Diddy and the gang defeat the evil Whizpig. But why is a Kremling helping Diddy? Although it's never described in-game, the instruction manual actually shines some light on this. As it turns out, Crunch paid Diddy Kong and his friends a visit to ensure they weren't up to anything nefarious against the Kremlings. But once he arrived at the island, he decided to help Diddy Kong out in the end. Now up to this point, the Critters only ever made grunt-like noises, but in Diddy Kong Racing, Crunch can actually be heard in English for the first time.
Bye, it's Crunch.
But interestingly, the remake on Nintendo DS featured a new opening cutscene, and it gives Crunch a snake-like voice that elongated his S's, although this didn't extend to his in-game quips during actual races. Despite this small role, Crunch's design actually influenced the rest of the Critters when they finally returned as enemies in Donkey Kong 64. And though they technically hadn't been in a game since the original, here the Critters come back with a vengeance, now being able to punch and bite, making them a little more lethal than in past games. Plus, they're all styling with the same skull and crossbones leather jacket that Crunch had in Diddy Kong Racing. Him helping to save the day just might have influenced the rest of the Critters. That or the kid knows how to merchandise. But the Critters are everywhere in Donkey Kong 64, not only in their standard appearance, but in many other roles as well. But rather than just being renamed something completely different like in past games, they actually all retain the Critter name this time around. Take the Mecha Critters for example, who sometimes go by the names of Toy Critters or Crowbots. They have the same attacks and look just like regular Critters, except the fact that they're, robots. This makes them much more durable, and as such they can only be defeated with orange grenades, a Kong's musical instrument, or a swing from Chunky Kong's Primate Punch. But there's no need to be too concerned as they only ever appeared in one level, Frantic Factory. Next up are the Shroom Critters that naturally only appear in Fungi Forest. These critters are a little different from the others in the game since they're colored blue and are quite a bit shorter and rounder. Their sole tactic is to hide in a mushroom costume that blends in with the other mushrooms in the forest. The only clue that it's a fake is the fact that they were bigger. If you get near, they'll immediately jump out of the ground and try to ram into you. It must be said though that they're one of the easiest enemies in the game to defeat, as any attack is able to take them down. Then there's Critters in a Sheet, and true to their name, they are literally critters hiding under a sheet in order to look like a ghost. It's kind of like your younger brother taking a bedsheet and cutting eye holes in a vain attempt to scare you, because that's about as effective as these critters are. But it seems that most critters realize how silly it all is, as this enemy is pretty rare, only appearing in Creepy Castle, and even then they sometimes don't even respawn after being killed. It's like they realized how dumb it was and just left, since it certainly doesn't make them any more effective. Like the Shroom Critters, they just try to run into you and can be taken out with any attack. Finally, there's the Bone Critters, sometimes referred to as Crossbones, who only appear in Creepy Castle and Fungi Forest at night. The bone critters are quite literally critter skeletons come to life. Rather than trying to bite or punch the player, they use their own bones as a club or by attempting a short-ranged kick. But what makes them trickier is that they're much faster than the other critters. The bone critters can be attacked with anything, and doing so will actually cause them to rattle before a piece of their body falls off. Though, unlike the critters in a sheet, these guys are kind of freaky. And while that may be all of the critters in Donkey Kong 64, there is one other enemy that returns from Donkey Kong Country: Crashes. They had been completely gone up until this point, but what's truly odd about their return is how different they look. Rather than being another variation of a critter, their design is a lot closer in appearance to Clubba, who appeared in Donkey Kong Country 2. They are now much bigger, more muscular, and even use a club to attack the Kongs. The only way to actually defeat one is to make them crash into something else. But there's one more intriguing tidbit to their design. While their body type is reminiscent of Clubba, their clothing is incredibly similar to what modern critters wear, which is probably just an odd coincidence. Following Donkey Kong 64, the next appearance of the critters was supposed to be as a playable character in Diddy Kong Pilot, which was a Game Boy Advance follow-up to Diddy Kong Racing. However, the project ended up being cancelled. Bits of the game have been brought to light over the years, and it's interesting to note how Kritter has become the face of the Kremlings outside of K. Rool. They were the only Kremling enemy that was planned to be in the game besides K. Rool himself. The Kritters even had one of the cups named after them. But the game wasn't meant to be, and the next time the Kritters appeared in a game was Donkey Kong King of Swing. What's strange though is that the game only referred to the Kritters as Kremlings, but their appearance was so obviously the Kritters even though this was the game that gave them their modern design: a pair of brown pants with a skull belt buckle. It was also the second time that a critter was playable. It could be unlocked and used in Jungle Jam mode, where it was then able to swing from pegs and use rocks or bombs as weapons. They returned in the sequel, Donkey Kong Jungle Climber, but there was nothing new about them in this game. Their last appearance in a Donkey Kong branded game was Donkey Kong Barrel Blast, but this game was unique in that not only were the standard critters playable, but multiple named critters were as well. They were named Cass, Calypso, and Kip. Cass is actually a critter child and the rival to Dixie Kong in the game, even matching Dixie's racing stats. And both her and Calypso are the first female critters that have explicitly been shown in the games. And strangely, both also somehow have hair, making them only the second Kremlings to possess this trait. Calypso is an older female critter with a somewhat unique skin tone, being a blue-green mixture. She can be unlocked in the game and actually keeps the skull belt design of the standard critters, but the rest of her is far from standard. She has trendier clothes and an afro, which is just weird. In the game, she acts as a rival to Tiny Kong and shares the same stats. Finally, there's Kip, who is also a critter child like Cass. The two might be brother and sister, but there's never been a confirmation of this fact. Mainly, he just looks like a little troublemaker with his skull emblazoned shirt. In Barrel Blast, he acts as the rival to Diddy Kong and, like the other rivals, shares his stats. Despite this initial appearance of the three, none of them have returned in future games outside of trophies in Super Smash Bros. Brawl. Instead, in recent years, the critters have been integrated into several Mario sports games. Their first appearance was a cameo in the background of Donkey Kong's court in Mario Power Tennis. But they became more active in Super Mario Strikers and its sequel, where they acted as the standard goalie for every team. The last sports game they appeared in to date was Mario Super Sluggers, where they had 4 differently colored variations: green, blue, red, and brown, each with their own unique stats. However, the green and blue critters finally did appear as enemies in Smash Run and Super Smash Bros. For 3DS. In this game, the green ones will try to bite your character repeatedly, while the blue ones swipe at you with their claws. And both versions gained a new attack where they tried to run into you while spinning their arms around, sometimes even achieving liftoff. There's just something about the simple design of the critters that make them so beloved. They can quite literally be adapted to any situation they're in, whether it's a pirate theme or a sporting event. Fans have hoped for their return along with the rest of the Kremlings in a new Donkey Kong Country game for years now, especially since they were replaced with completely new enemies in the past 2 games. But seriously, just showing up as background cameos or in sports games isn't enough. While we can't say if it'll ever happen, their original appearances will never be forgotten. They just work as an enemy. Yes, they can be beaten rather easily, but it doesn't take much for one to catch you off guard and take you out. And that, my friends, is why you should know your enemy. It just may save your virtual life.